Thank you, Joe, for your question. So Joe's question, if you didn't pick it up, was, well, what is a typical walkthrough session going to look like? So I'm going to take you through what a session might look like, albeit that mine is actually taking place here online, whereas you would normally meet within small groups. At the moment, the establishing routines, the I do and the we do groups consist of approximately 12 to 15 members of staff, whereas the you do group, as you know, having been in the room, has about 45 to 50 members of staff in. So what we intend to do in future is split that group down into three. So there will be three separate groups. Those groups will be made of your choices, where it is that you want to focus your walkthroughs on within the you do group, and we'll establish those learning communities and those learning groups so that we get the opportunity to sit round together and discuss your walkthroughs, but also discuss generic walkthroughs. So a typical walkthrough session is going to involve some coach input, some lead member of staff input on a particular walkthrough, and then it then gives you the opportunity to then sit down within smaller groups, maybe 3 or 4 people, to discuss where you're at with your current walkthrough so that you can change, adapt, develop your pedagogy around those particular walkthroughs. As we've said right from the start, it may be that you're choosing to work on 2 or 3 walkthroughs throughout the year. It may be that you're working on a cluster of 7 or 8 walkthroughs. They all interlink to each other, and I'm going to try and show you that as we work through the session now. So you do independent practice. First thing that we would always do is we need to establish what independent practice is all about. So independent practice is that idea of getting students to take responsibility, take ownership of their own learning. And we can only get them to that place once we've done the I do and the we do phase. We can only do that with guided instruction and scaffolded instruction in order to ensure that the youngsters are in a good place to start their practice, in a place where they can actually work independently and they're not solely reliant on the teachers. For me, the reason that I chose independent practice is I felt I was working much, much harder than the students. And when I look back at videos of the lessons, I can see that it was me working extremely hard, and actually the students were fairly passive in terms of what was going on, and that I think led to a breakdown in some of the results and the end product that those students got. I really like this quote from Walt Disney, and it says, "We keep moving forwards, opening new doors and doing new things because we're curious, and curiosity didn't kill the cat, but it keeps leading us down new paths." That for me, in essence, is why we would want to develop independent practice. It is very much about empowering students to take ownership of their own learning. If we look at some of the research around independent learning, we look at the work of perhaps Nichols or the work of Reeve, there are these following statements that have been made. If students identify how the material will help them or what skills it will develop, they're more likely to engage. Something as simple as completing the sentence, "Doing well at this will help me because," is a good starting point here. So that's from Reeve. And then Nichols states, "Students who feel most successful when they've mastered a task. This means putting in maximum effort, taking pleasure and refining skills." And it's true. There is this incredible sense of satisfaction knowing that you've done a task and you've done a task well. And realistically, that's what independent learning is about for us. That's what we're trying to encourage. So a typical walkthrough is going to start by talking and revisiting these main points. Now, I've got some key questions that I'd like you to consider. Normally, were I leading a group, were I leading a coaching team, I might have, if we were in the you do session, I've got 15 members of staff, I might have you sitting around 3 tables in groups of 5. And the reason that I would have you in those 3 tables is to discuss these key questions around this walkthrough. Now, the walkthrough that I've chosen today is independent practice. So here's my first question for you to consider. Explain one way in which independent practice can guide automacy in learning. How does independent practice affect autonomous learning. Secondly, how could you identify which pupils need scaffolding removing, and which may still need support? How would you go on to support these pupils while still encouraging independent practice? Yeah, that's an interesting one. So consider that, write down your thoughts, talk with the people next to you. And finally, what could you do if the pupils could not meet the challenges as the challenges increased over time? What would you do? How would you step back? Would you go back a phase to the we do phase? And that's an important challenge to think about as well. If you're doing this online, please pause the video now and take the opportunity to reflect on those 3 key questions, thinking really carefully about your answers to them. Please feel free to discuss them with other people. When you're ready, please press play again. So I've initially considered these 3 questions about independent practice. Now I'm actually going to go through the process of going through a walkthrough myself. So I've got this hexagonal walkthrough icon that's in my map. And when I click on this hexagonal icon, I get access to this page here. Now, this page here is a page that I can share myself that's got some notes on me. That's got some notes that I can use and has got the content to the rest of the walkthrough. Now, in the coach-led session, the coach might take you through the videos, might take you through the slideshows, might do both. The important thing for me is to access what's called the adapt notes. So the adapt notes are just here on the screen underneath, and you've got a link in place for them. In order to save this sheet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on File, and I'm going to create my own copy. I'm going to make a copy for myself. As soon as I make a copy, it's then shared into my drive, and it becomes editable. It's something that I can change. You'll notice on the sheet itself that actually what we have is we have the key questions around this particular topic. They're the questions that I just asked you a moment ago. Things to think about in advance, things to go back after the session and think about afterwards. I'm going to start by clicking on the video and sharing the video with you. So let's listen to what Tom has to say about independent practice.
Independent practice. Independent practice is a process by which you think very explicitly about the activity students will engage in when they have moved through the guided phase and are now able to pursue independent practice of the things you've been teaching them. Ideally, initially, the things they'll be doing will be very similar to the examples that you guided them through, so they're familiar. But then you can extend the range of those things, you can reduce guidance slowly, and you can increase the level of difficulty depending on the success rate of the students. Students who are already more successful, typically older students, can sometimes move more rapidly to this independent stage. But students who are more novice, more vulnerable in their learning, will perhaps need to move more slowly to it. But it's important to have this in your mind all the time. How am I going to notch down the guidance, the scaffolding, and increase independence with some checking in between? Because it's important that the students are practicing success, and so you need to have some way of monitoring without them feeling overly supported. So they're genuinely thinking for themselves, using their own recall, problem solving for themselves, and becoming independent in guiding their own learning. That's the goal. So independent practice is a very important walkthrough to apply the adapt process to, because it will have very specific manifestations in different subjects and for different age students. But it really is important that the scaffolding comes down and independent practice becomes the goal for most learning sequences.
So there was our video on independent practice, talking us through the processes that are in place. I'm now going to do, and I'm going to take you through what my adapt sheet might look like for independent practice. So I'm actually going to share with you an issue that I had within one of my classes, and try and talk you through how I might then build on this. Now, this building, this development has taken several months, has taken quite a period of time in order to get to. And I actually don't know if what I'm doing is perfect. I mean, there is going to be a stage where I'm going to have to keep going back to look at this, to improve, to develop the work that I'm doing around independent practice. And I recognize that this is a long-term process. My particular challenge is about an NEA piece of work. Now, for those of you that are involved in NEAs within your subjects, you'll know that there are pieces of work that are done that are about independent work from the students. You as the teacher are not supposed to create so much framework and so much scaffold that actually it just becomes a fill in the box exercise. It is about students doing their own work and doing it in a controlled environment. So for my particular NEA, I focused on my A-level NEA, which is about an analysis of a sporting performance. So watching a competitive situation, analysing the biomechanical movements that are involved, identifying weaknesses within the defensive and the tactical decisions that have been made, and then evaluating from a theoretical point of view how we go about improving those weaknesses. So it sounds really, really complicated, but it's not. The first thing that I think about is what is it that I've been doing? What have I been attempting to do in the past? So I would always teach lessons on joint actions, on muscular contractions, on planes and axis of motion. During those taught lessons, I would take students through the I do and the we do phases, and I would model very specific sporting actions. So, for example, a favourite one might be the squat action, or maybe the press up action. And we will talk to students about the types of muscular contractions that take place, the isotonic, eccentric, and the isotonic concentric contractions, the joints that are concerned. So we might be talking about the shoulder joint and the elbow joint, the ball and socket joint, the hinge joint that's taking place. We would talk about the main muscles that are being used, the agonist and the antagonistic muscle. And we would model all that. We'd model the language, we'd create a framework around which the students would then be able to biomechanically analyze the movement. And we do lots of different movements, particularly around fitness and weight training movements themselves. The students would then have a go at some exam questions, which would be modeled, and sometimes we would give them the mark schemes and they would self-mark those particular models before moving on to the NEA biomechanical analysis of their own action. So my develop phase then. So I thought really carefully about what was going on, and I thought, right, well, what is it that the students are struggling with? So in the develop phase, what I was finding is that students were trying to analyze their competitive match and struggling to identify the individual skills that weren't happening for them. So I was like, well, okay, so the work that we've done in class was all about fitness movements, was about the press up action. Actually, in the sport, it isn't a press up action, is it? And I needed to find ways of creating models for students where they're actually thinking about the sporting action itself. So I introduced a scaffolding, a graduated scaffold for them that took them through a number of different sporting actions. So actual ones that I use. So for example, it might be a running action, the drive phase of a sprint. It could be the service phase within a tennis match. It could be the kicking of a rugby ball. And I deliberately worked in several different sporting examples. Now, in my graduated pack that I gave, the first pack that I gave, or the first example, all the writing was done for the students. So I gave them the writing for a particular skill, and it was literally questions around the skill. Can you identify in the writing where this is? What action's taking place? Can you recognize the way in which the writing, the prose has taken place? The next example, the students had to start to add more of the writing themselves. So one of the particular phases of the skill, they might have had to do their own writing one. Right to the last skill, where literally the last skill is a series of questions and the students have to answer their questions in their continuous prose. So I was really happy that the reintroduction of the graduated scaffold enabled the students to start to access the different skills. And I was seeing much, much better outcomes from the students in terms of what they were actually writing and putting down on paper. The next thing that I wanted to get to was the adapt phase. And I was thinking, okay, so the adapt phase, in that adapt phase, I'm thinking about this particular class. What are the actions that needed to be taken with this particular class? Now, you'll notice that I've got some slightly different colors on the screen now. And it's not because I'm trying to create cognitive load for people. It's so that you can see what's going on, because very much once you start to adapt, you'll realize that actually I need to go back to the development phase. And I need to bring something back into the development phase itself. So as I started to adapt my teaching and I put in the workbooks, it became clear that the students were going into the analysis phase having already decided, okay, that it's that skill. I'm not actually going to watch the video of what I'm doing. I'm just going to tell you that tackling is my weakness. And the reason that tackling is my weakness is in the 37th minute I missed a tackle. And I was like, well, what's the justification behind that? Are you showing the examiner? Are you showing the marker that there's an issue there? So I needed to do something different in my work. So I needed to go back to the development phase, and I needed to think about lessons where we were using notational analysis to identify success and failure of different skills within a sporting performance. So I introduced a badminton lesson where we videoed badminton performances, and we sat down together with a picture of a court. We identified the different shots, and we literally created a tally chart of different shots and a tally chart of successful and unsuccessful shots in order to start to identify what is my biggest weakness. The other thing that I was very much feeling in the adapt phase is that the students were very unsure of themselves, despite the fact that they could do these exam questions, despite the fact that they worked through the workbook. They still wanted constant reassurance of what they were doing, and they were becoming overly reliant on my feedback. I gave them models of what their work should look like in terms of a good model. I gave them a bad model, so something that I didn't want to see from them, and we compared and contrasted the two, so they tried to identify what was going on. And I was finding that students were picking up some of those models, and they were literally, because they'd seen that model of a particular skill, they wanted to copy that model. So I had this issue of plagiarism, and I had this issue of students wanting to actually just copy what was in place for me. So you'll see that I've written those two different areas down in the adapt phase, and you'll notice that with the first one that we talked about, breaking down to the analysis phase, I took that back to development. For the adapt around plagiarism, what I did is I thought back to something that had occurred in my previous school, and I was a little bit horrified when I saw this. I think it was back in 2004. I a little bit green behind the gills, and went into a science lesson, and I saw this big poster, and I was like, well, the teacher's there to answer your questions. And I was thinking, as the teacher answers the questions, the student has a misconception, they do it. And I saw this poster that said C3 before me. And I was like, really? How rude is that? Actually, it wasn't rude at all. It's very much about developing that idea of independent practice and finding the answer for yourself. I saw a great example. I remember going up to one of Dan Pilgrim's lessons a couple of weeks ago, and I saw Dan Pilgrim using just this very method at the start. Very, very explicit instructions to the youngsters. What do you do when you get stuck? And their hands were going up. Oh, I ask you, sir. Now, what do you do before you ask me? So it's a series of questions of what can you do yourself? Where can you look for support? So can you look to the people around you for support? Can you use dictionaries? Can you use internet sources before you go to the teacher? And I think C3 before me is a really, really good way of adapting that. And it's a great way of breaking what we call the separation effect. So the separation effect is something that we very much talk about when we're dealing with youngsters with special educational needs. because the separation effect is the effect that happens where they don't feel part of the class. They feel that they are completely independent of the class, and that that's because they're getting special stuff done to them all the time. They've got TA working with them. Well, what we want to do is create a separation effect between the TA and the student and create more of a joint effect with the rest of the class. In the same way that in this particular phase, I want to create this separation effect between the teacher and the students. I want them to find out the answers for themselves. I want them to go through the process of green penning, of redrafting, of correcting their own work and recognizing what those corrections are. So I felt that that was a very quick adaptation that could be made, and we could make sure that that was in place. It was a poster I could put in the room. It was something that I could put up in front of them. And as I started to move through and started to think further about what else needed to be in place, I moved to the adapt phase, and I moved through the adapt phase and moved to practice. Now, in the practice, you'll notice that these are the points that I've made here. I talked about notational analysis still becoming problematic. I was finding that, yes, we were doing it. We could do some of the basic stuff, but students were taking shortcuts. They weren't watching their videos. So how was I going to make that a better process? Was it about a piece of software that I introduced? And what I thought about really carefully was something called video tagging software. So that's something that actually I'm investigating at the moment. This isn't a finished deal. So it's something that I'm very much looking for this year. Can I find a way to make that process easier for them, where they can watch a video, they can tag particular skills, and it means that they can find those skills straight away, and then they can tag a different set of skills, tag a third set of skills. It's not going to take away the process of having to watch the video, but it might make it easier for them to actually note where skills are taking place. I thought very much about this idea of, okay, how can I check their work without having to be giving them feedback all the time, without having to absolutely drive them, without them wanting to become so reliant on me. So that very much fell into, okay, I can use the Google Classroom, and I can use the Google Classroom, I can use in Google Classroom, I can use the share to all students, so that every student has their own copy of a document, and then I can find those documents by clicking on my drive, going to Classroom, finding that particular piece of work, and there I've got a folder with all of their pieces of work in, and I can actually monitor what they're doing each lesson. Sometimes in the past, what I did initially last year is I highlighted their text in a particular color. I just changed the color of their text to where they got to in a particular lesson, and I could actually monitor how much was going in lessons, how much was going in homework. And I think that's a really useful tool if you're in a subject where you're doing a long-term piece of coursework. The other thing that it helped me with was it helped me keep an ongoing assessment record. I wasn't reliant on just seeing this final piece of work and then having to mark it. I was marking it as we were going along. There were no surprises whatsoever to me because I had this ongoing sheet. So I'm thinking really about art. I'm thinking about D&T. How rather than wait till this final piece of work and the project is handed into you, you can produce your mark sheets as you're going along, and it makes the final mark far easier to come by. The instruction that students were being given, they didn't seem to know the specification well enough. So how do I improve their knowledge and understanding of the specification? How do I make sure that I'm making reference to their core and their advanced skills? And again, this is something that you will find in your specifications for your different subjects. Are they aware of the map that they're following? Are they aware of what's actually needed, or are they just trying to answer this one particular question? And again, the more knowledge that we have, the more hinterland knowledge in the background, the easier it is for us to assimilate new knowledge. The easier it is for us to make links and create those models. And the other issue that I had when I was working through this is students tending to drift over a period of time, because the project is in two parts, 20 marks for the analysis, 25 marks for the evaluative part. I was finding that they're putting in so much effort in the analysis that they get to the evaluation, it's just like, need to finish this now. It's like that job that you do at home, isn't it? That you work through that job and you get towards the back end, the finishing touches, and you're like, I just want this finished now. And maybe you take shortcuts and maybe you speed through. So considering where I go with that, and I think the idea that I would be working on alongside independent practice is this idea of sustained independent practice. So I'm going to access that walkthrough and I'm going to go through the same adapt process in that walkthrough. I'm not yet at test. I got some results from last year, wasn't particularly happy with those results last year. So I need to think about where test comes in again this year. Do I bring the projects forwards much earlier? Do I have a deadline that's months in advance of what it has been previously? Do I need to adapt, go into the adapt and change that model? Am I getting a positive moderators report from that process? So I hope that that's given you an idea of how I might go through that process, how I might attempt it. And I might then, even afterwards, I might rag these processes. So where am I in this particular phase? And I think my initial attempt, I might be ragging that one green. There is definitely some development that needs to take place, and I need to think really carefully about that. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to rag that one. I'm going to rag that one orange. So that's my area that I'm focusing on. I know that I still need to have adaptations with my class. This year I've got a much bigger class, so with that bigger class I need to focus on a much bigger range of particular projects from the youngsters, so I need to make sure that I've got all my bases covered at that stage. So I'm going through this ragging process and I'm thinking about how my developments, and I might be setting myself some individual targets along the way based on this. So that very much brings me back to what we were working on before, and I'm going to be coming back to the questions. How does independent practice guide my automacy in learning? And my answer to that is I've got to spend a great deal of time setting up the independent practice. I've got to ensure that the success is there. I've got to make sure I've explicitly explained the material to youngsters. I've got to make sure that my support structures are right. I need to ensure that my feedback is correct and that the youngsters are understanding exactly what it is that they need to do by knowing the specification. My identification of which students need support, making sure that I'm sitting down with those students for a little bit of extra time. Perhaps that's about planning my routeway around the classroom a little bit more, and my seating plan, adapting that seating plan, changing that seating plan so that I visit those youngsters more in the first instance to make sure that they've got the support that's needed. So I go into my establishing routines walkthrough and I pick up my seating plan walkthrough, and I think really carefully about that. And then this big one for me, this is the biggest one. What could I do if the pupils cannot meet the challenges? So I have to go back into practice mode. I've got to go back into adaptive mode and really think about what's going on in the future. I hope that that's interesting for those people that have been watching, gives you an idea of what a walkthrough might look like. But it's very much this process of sitting together, 3 or 4 people sitting together, talking about the processes they've been using, running ideas past each other, developing those ideas further. Now, for your particular walkthrough, you need to ensure that you've joined the teaching classroom for the UDO. The teaching classroom code is all letters in lowercase and just numbers. So it's L4J2GJN is the Google Classroom code that you're using. I think Gareth and Ellie have asked you to please indicate a group of walkthroughs that you wish to work on from the independent practice map. Please write your name on the slides or email them separately so that they can actually start to put these groups together. We've got the walkthrough materials that you may wish to have a look through. If you search for this particular website here, the walkthruus.co.uk website, you will then be able to access the website by using this username and this password. Please do not change the password. It's one that I've set up as a generic password for the whole school so that all the teaching staff in the school can access that, look at the various different material and the various different research that's in place. I look forward to seeing you at our next session, which is in November, and look forward to having positive conversations about what you've chosen to do and look at where we're at this moment in time.